So I have the pleasure of welcoming Kelsey Timler here for the CRiHHI Critical Research in Health and Equities Seminar Series. So Kelsey is a research manager for Work to Give, so it's a broader project within which her thesis was completed recently. And Kelsey worked with myself and Colleen Barco and Patty Spettle at the School of Population and Public Health. So this is her show, so off you go.
Thanks, Helen.
Welcome.
So I'm going to talk about my thesis research, which was looking at a garden and a minimum security institution in Mission that grows, the men there grow and donate vegetables to Chilcotin First Nation. So excited to talk about food and watch you all eat your lunches. I would like to acknowledge that my research was funded by the CRiHHI Canadian Graduate Master's Scholarship Award, which was very helpful. So I set out to find to what extent and what way does the Prison Garden Project affect the experiences of meaningful work for men who are in custody in a federal prison, the food security and sovereignty of economically vulnerable Chilcotin families, and any possible meaningful connections between the Chilcotin communities that receive the food and the men who grow and harvest a portion of the food that they eat in their holistic lives. So this work is based in a foundational understanding of Canada as a country that is influenced by historic and ongoing colonialism. Prior to colonization, Indigenous peoples throughout Canada subsisted off of diverse and varied food groups and had complex and healthy relationships with their land. Colonization disrupted a lot of these relationships, and while communities continue to have resurgences within their food, colonization such as residential schools, Indian hospitals, the disruption of access to subsistence activities through regulation and resource extraction continue to create barriers to food. So it's within this context that the Chilcotin Nation is receiving this donated food. So across prisons in Canada and globally, work in prisons for people who are incarcerated is often really menial and mundane. There's a lot of idle time and folks don't get a lot of meaning out of what they're doing. This is unfortunate because there is research that having meaningful work while incarcerated is linked to rehabilitation and reducing recidivism. Gardening, I will argue, and it's supported by the literature, offers an opportunity for meaningful work. In community gardens outside of prison contexts, gardening can increase social capital, community capacity to access resources, and social learning, can improve health and social behaviors amongst people to foster individual and community well-being, and can lead to empowerment among disadvantaged groups. Hi. And increased connection and belonging among isolated peoples through the growing of food together, and then also the opportunity to be able to share food with their friends and neighbors. Within prisons, gardening reduces depression scores and substance use, has been shown to increase relative autonomy, improve relationships with correctional staff, and increase well-being and self-worth, and reduce recidivism over time, which is the risk of reoffending. It's also a neutral and destigmatizing activity, so people can engage in something that offers healing benefits without feeling like they're actually being treated, quote unquote. So this work was ethnographic in nature. I conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 Chilcotin community members in one of the 6 communities, and then 10 men in federal custody. I also interviewed 5 stakeholders who have roles either in the prison or the communities or through the distribution process that takes place. I also did participant observations, so I spent roughly 80 hours in the garden with the men harvesting vegetables, shoveling goat manure, and delivering things to local food banks. And then I also lived in the community for 3 weeks. So time was spent helping distribute vegetables, cooking with folks, watching them fish, cutting fish, smoking fish, lots of things to do with fish. I conducted iterative thematic analysis, used mind mapping and journaling to create a coding framework that I then used through in vivo. I should say that all the interviews are transcribed and anonymized. And this work was also based in the principles of community-driven research. So one of the first things that I heard was that community members were getting these wonderful, beautiful organic vegetables, but they were often unfamiliar to them. So things like kohlrabi, squash, kale. I have a background as a professional cook. I did that for about a decade, so took what I heard there and then partnered with some local people to conduct these cooking workshops, taking the vegetables coming from the men and integrating them into healthy food so that people could take them into their homes and know what to do with them and appreciate them on their own. So I'm assuming everyone knows where Mission is, but it's the little yellow star. The Chilcotin territory is wide and vast. The one community I focused on is about 500 kilometers north of Mission, and the closest urban center is Williams Lake. So I call the prison a garden because the men call it a garden, but it's really a farm. It's 7.5 acres big, large. Last year, they produced 158,000 pounds of food. This year has been a little bit different just due to the weird weather. It's been precariously funded in the past, but in the last season, an NGO called Lookout Housing Society took over the funding and has been trying to support it so that it becomes more sustainable over time. It was originally developed in 2012 by a now retired warden who saw that men had a lot of idle time and also saw that there was a huge need for food security in indigenous communities. He's from the Prince George area, so he thought he could connect the men's idle time and willingness to give back to the community with children's need for food. So I'm going to go into findings first for the men in prison and then for the Chilcotin communities and then kind of map it all together. So the first thing I found for the men in the prison was that the impacts were layered. Over time, they deepened. They were also intersected by the themes of freedom and autonomy, which were made meaningful not just because gardening is an autonomous activity, but because they were incarcerated and had experienced limited freedom of choice and of movement, some of them for decades. Each men's experiences were altered by time, such as the length of time they've been incarcerated, how long they've been working in the garden, visibility, watching things grow, being seen donating, and then actually meeting the people that they were donating to, and then personal context such as ethnic identity, socioeconomic status, and historical links to food, whether or not they grew up on a family farm, stuff like that. So first layer is access to food. It's a minimum security institution, so the men live in shared houses and cook for themselves, and they're able to take a small portion of what they grow home to cook with. This is hugely meaningful and provided them with healthy, nutritious vegetables that don't necessarily make it into the institutions given the budget cuts. As one man said, I eat a lot of stuff out there that I never even tried before, like eggplant. Your diet changes quite a lot if you're out there. I hardly eat meat at all during the summers. This access to food was made meaningful by some of the men's experiences of childhood hunger. For other, it connected them to memories of working on farms and their grandmother's gardens. A lot of the men I talked to had been incarcerated for decades, and there are culinary programs offered, so a lot of them had very impressive culinary skills. And the access to these vegetables allowed them to be creative, to have the freedom to cook things that they liked and share them with their housemates. So the second layer is working to escape and to produce. The difference between being in the garden and in the institution is huge. You can hear birds. There was a bear hanging out, a very friendly bear, when I was there last summer. As one man said, you're hearing birds, you're listening to the wind through the trees, you'll see the odd wildlife. In other jobs, you're in a building, there's bright lights and it's noise. Simply being in the sunshine every day was helpful. They also were able to escape or at least mediate some of the prison politics that play out. Not necessarily that they didn't happen in the garden, but that it's such a large tract of land that if men didn't want to talk to different men because of the crime that they'd allegedly done or whatever, they could just go their separate ways and work in peace. They also work to produce. The huge yield and the visibility of what they're doing created a lot of pride for the men. As they showed me around, they were so excited to point out like super big cabbages, and it was just palpable how good they felt about themselves that they were growing this food. They washed all the root vegetables so that they were clean and beautiful before they donated them. As one man said, it makes you feel good, that accomplishment, when you come out here and see all these black tarps in the fall. And for a long time, it doesn't look like it's growing very much. And then all of a sudden, you come out here for a long weekend, and it's like, wow, look at that stuff. The next layer, and one of the most meaningful ones, I think, is giving back. The men got to donate the food. For some of them, they had experiences of childhood hunger, as I mentioned previously. So giving back not only made them feel good about themselves, but allowed them to reflect on their own experiences as a child and the forces and structures that had resulted in their own incarceration. But men didn't need to have that experience of childhood hunger to feel what it meant to give, because the farmer had started this thing called escorted temporary absences. So the men actually got to go and deliver to local food banks and soup kitchens and physically hand over vegetables, meet some of the folks who were going to take it home and cook. As one guy said, it's my joy. So the final layer is imagining a meaningful future. A lot of the men, I think the average length of incarceration was 17.9 years, with a range from 4 months to 39 years. So a lot of them had been in prison for a very, very long time. And that results in a fear of the outside. Phones were a thing. Cell phones weren't a thing for many of them before they were incarcerated. So this idea of the outside world being strange and unwelcoming because they were labeled as criminals was really impactful for a lot of the guys. But the ability to actually grow food and then give it and look people in the eye, share recipes, tell them how to cut open certain squash helped to reduce that fear. That's what you need to go out and meet people and control that fear. The farmer also played a really important role in this. He has a background in logging and had a very sarcastic, fun relationship with the guys. And for many of them, he was the first positive role model that they'd ever had. So his interactions with them and their interactions with him allowed them to imagine a future where in different contexts they could come up to work every day, have a boss that they respected and they got along with, and an environment that they thrived within. Going to the food banks and soup kitchens also helped the men show the world who they were outside of the label of criminal. The farmer told me a story about how they are invited for lunch at one of the soup kitchens. And at one point they asked, how long has that gentleman been in prison? And he mentioned that he'd been in prison for 25 years. And then no one sat with him for a few weeks. But over the course of months and months and days, they eventually continued to eat lunch with him. And when he's not there, they actually ask, hey, where's that guy? So just that constant connection and recognizing of shared humanity. So now, shifting to the reserve, this is Quesco, nestled amongst the hills. There's about 300 registered members, and I think maybe 150 of them live there. The neat nesting of impacts that I saw in the prison was disrupted by a lack of communication and a distribution process that didn't take into account community strengths, contemporary foodways and insecurities, and the wider history of colonialism. So because of this, the distribution process passively aligned itself with the marginalization of Indigenous people. By not talking to communities about what they needed, what their priorities were, and how the program could be strengthened, it relegated them to the role of passive recipients. But despite that, the desire for freedom and sovereignty and the deeply held belief in teaching and learning that exists within the community resulted in lots of possibilities for there to be growth and improvements of the project, which I'll get into in a bit. Going through those first two truncated impacts, the first is access to food. So vegetables were distributed amongst the 6 communities. It was not done, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me. The community I focused on got about 1,000 pounds once last summer. And that's a huge amount, but it's also not very much at all. Distribution wasn't systematic, so some folks would get vegetables and say, this is great, it saves me a trip into town. The nearest grocery store is in Williams Lake, which is about 50 kilometers away. For other folks, it was the first and only fresh vegetables that they probably get all month. Vegetables were often left in parking lots without any information, so folks didn't know where they were coming from or what they were or how to use them. So while the vegetables were appreciated, it wasn't enough to make any substantial impact on food security. The second layer is connections with men. This has a lot of potential but was disrupted by lack of communication. Most people that I talked to didn't know where vegetables were coming from. They thought that they were being provided by the distribution partner. Everyone that I did tell, which was everyone that I met, about the men growing them was wholly positive about it. Everyone knew someone who was or had been in prison or had been incarcerated themselves. So the community has a very real lived experience of the impacts of colonialism and how it creates barriers to education, employment, and reduces chances for well-being. The men were offering food, and the Chilcotin people saw it as an opportunity for a relationship. Unfortunately, the distribution process didn't really support that. For Chilcotin people, food is relationship. It's based in reciprocity and healing. This is a quote from a chief of their community. He was talking about when people come back from prison, from foster care, from simply being away, how a lot of them have to learn to be Chilcotin, have to live that life. Food's a big part of that. I think that's always been there for our people, especially the salmon. That's why our people fight so hard to keep the river the way it is. So food is more than simply subsistence. It's about connection to land, history, and community. I love this picture. So currently the project is having huge benefits for the men in the prison. They're able to support their own autonomy, to develop self-worth, and to see themselves as something above and beyond a label that's been prescribed to them. Unfortunately, the distribution process is not giving those same opportunities to the Chilcotin people that receive the food. A few simple shifts, I think, could change this. First, from gratitude to reciprocity. Instead of expecting people to say thank you for vegetables, actually connecting with them about how this could become a two-way relationship. From passive recipients to partners in growth. Folks that I talked to were so excited about the potential of learning more about the men and helping them in other ways beyond the context of simply getting food. And those things should be supported. And thirdly, from food security to land and food sovereignty. Food security is a Eurocentrically defined idea about what health is, and without a larger recognition of land and relationship, it's missing the mark and will never actually achieve true food security for Indigenous people, because that's impossible without food sovereignty. There's a few implications for this. For prison practice, correctional agriculture is becoming really widespread, particularly in the US, but oftentimes vegetables are either sold to offset costs or given to prison population. It makes a lot of sense economically, but the actual donating adds so much meaning, and that needs to be recognized. Additionally, the men got so much benefit from simply being outside. Gardening is low cost, but even today the garden's having problems with their budget. So simply having green spaces that men can access is a low barrier intervention that will have implications for men's mental health and well-being. I mentioned that the farmer has a background in logging. There is some research that people who have bartending backgrounds make really good correctional officers just because they're used to engaging with diverse people in non-confrontational ways. So when the farmer eventually retires, and in other contexts, having people who have unconventional backgrounds that maybe don't fit into the correctional officer box that you would imagine is a huge plus. And then also there's a huge need to recognize the strengths of the community and to have their input in these kinds of projects. For research, within community gardens outside of prison contexts, they have huge benefits for social bonding and community cohesion. I didn't actually find that within the prison garden. So looking at what kind of factors and processes are mediating that would be interesting. It would also be great to look at the influences of age and gender on prison garden impacts and then prison programming more generally. Additionally, the men self-select. So the guys that showed up every day to work were often guys who had jobs that they showed up for every day before their incarceration. So finding a way for getting men who aren't maybe used to waking up at 7:30 and working in the hot sun and the rain or whatever through the door so they can benefit from the program is important. I love qualitative methods, and I think the stories that I heard lend themselves well to ethnography. But given policy and funding context and the need for additional support for these kinds of projects, having a longitudinal study that follows the men throughout their release would be beneficial. And then finally, food security research, whether based in public health, health promotion, nursing, needs to recognize the colonial context and the importance of land relationships. Food security isn't enough. Food sovereignty is what people need to be working towards. So next steps. I conducted a couple cooking workshops last summer and was hoping to do some more this summer. Unfortunately, for many reasons, there was rampant wildfires and folks were just not interested in learning about kale, which is totally fair. But the plan is to continue to do these workshops and to find funding that will offer support to talk not only about how to use vegetables donated by the men, but whether or not community gardens would work in communities, if communities are interested in that, or if food sovereignty for them is more about advocating for the closing of farm salmon or learning how to compost or whatever that is. So doing community-based and driven work, looking at how to take the strengths and the knowledge that exists in the prison and connect that to the community in a way that they see fit. I'm also in conversation with some people at Lookout Society and some of their partners to create a recipe booklet. I forgot to add a slide, but I did create these veggie info sheets in partnership with a community dietitian at the Chilcotin National Government that are now being handed out with every order of vegetables. So if you get a thing of squash, it just explains what squash is, how to store it, some simple recipes. Partnering with a Chilcotin organization was really helpful because they were able to let me know if people actually have soy sauce in their cupboards or making them as accessible as possible. So over the winter, the plan is to create a cohesive cookbook that integrates the work that I did in partnership with the Chilcotin National Government, as well as other Indigenous people who have gardens across the Lower Mainland. Thank you.